The small English village of Hexham lies quiet in the Northumberland countryside, its stone cottages and winding lanes holding secrets that defy every rational explanation science has carefully constructed about the nature of consciousness, memory, and the finality of death. On an ordinary afternoon in 1965, two young girls, Jennifer and Gillian Pollock, stood at the corner of a street they had never walked before in their short lives. They were 4 and 5 years old. Their father, John Pollock, watched in silence as his daughters began pointing at specific locations along the road, their small fingers trembling as they spoke with an unsettling confidence that chilled him to his core. Jennifer pointed to a spot on the pavement and said, "That's where the car hit Joanna." Gillian turned toward a particular section of the sidewalk and whispered, "Jacqueline's blood was here." The girls described details of a horrific accident with precision that should have been impossible. They spoke of two sisters struck down by a speeding vehicle. Their lives ended in seconds of twisted metal and screaming tires. They recounted the color of the dresses the dead girls wore, the exact position of their bodies after impact, and the way bystanders had screamed and covered their eyes. But here is what transforms this from merely disturbing into something that reaches into the deepest foundations of what we believe about existence itself. Jennifer and Gillian were born 17 months after that accident occurred. The two sisters they described, Joanna and Jacqueline, had been their own older siblings, killed on May 11, 1957, when a car mounted the sidewalk in their hometown of Hexham. The girls speaking about blood on pavement had never witnessed the tragedy. They had never been told these specific details. They were describing their own sisters' deaths from before they were born, with knowledge that seemed pulled from memories that could not possibly belong to them. Can consciousness survive the death of the body? Can memories transfer from one human being to another through mechanisms science refuses to acknowledge? Can souls return in new flesh, carrying with them the trauma and knowledge of violent endings? These questions sound like theology, like mysticism, like ancient beliefs we thought we had outgrown in our age of brain scans and neural mapping. But the Pollock sisters represent only the beginning of a pattern that has forced researchers, psychologists, and even skeptical scientists to confront evidence that refuses to disappear under scrutiny. This is not a story about faith. This is not about what we wish to be true, or what brings us comfort in the face of mortality. This is about 5 specific categories of evidence, 5 signs that appear again and again in documented cases around the world, that challenge everything we think we know about death being the end. The first sign, impossible knowledge. Children speaking languages they have never been taught, describing places they have never visited with accuracy that can be verified against historical record. The second sign, unexplained physical marks. Birthmarks appearing on bodies in the exact locations where fatal wounds ended a previous life. The third sign, phobias without origin. Terror responses to specific objects or situations that connect directly to the manner of a violent death. The fourth sign, behavioral memories. Skills, preferences, and habits that manifest without learning, as if muscle memory itself can transcend the grave. And the fifth sign, perhaps the most disturbing, the ability to identify people from a previous existence, to recognize faces and speak names that should be unknown to them. Over the next chapters, we will examine each of these signs through cases that have been investigated, documented, and argued over by researchers for decades. We will travel from the English countryside to villages in Asia, where reincarnation is not a fringe belief, but an accepted part of existence. We will meet the scientists who started as skeptics and found themselves unable to explain away what they witnessed. We will hear testimony from families torn apart by children who remember dying as someone else, and we will examine physical evidence that exists in medical records and historical documents. But let me be clear about what awaits in this investigation. Some of what you will hear is deeply unsettling. These are not gentle stories of souls peacefully moving from one life to another. These are accounts of children waking up screaming about burning to death, of small hands reaching for throats, describing the sensation of being strangled, of young voices pleading for mothers who died decades before these children were conceived. This is memory as wound, consciousness as something that refuses to release its grip, even when the brain that held it has turned to dust. The Pollock sisters lived their entire lives marked by what they remembered. As they grew older, the memories faded, as they often do in these cases, slipping away like dreams upon waking. But in those early years, their parents watched them play games that their dead sisters had invented, watched them recognize toys that had been hidden away, watched them navigate their old family home with the confidence of children who had lived there before, even though the family had moved after the accident and before the girls were born. What makes a case credible? What separates genuine mystery from fantasy, from false memory, from the elaborate constructions of wishful thinking? These questions will follow us through every account. We will examine the work of researchers like Ian Stevenson, who spent 40 years documenting thousands of cases with the rigor of a criminal investigator. We will look at the methods used to verify claims, the ways that fraud is detected and eliminated, and the cases that remain unexplained even after every rational alternative has been exhausted. The journey ahead demands that we hold two contradictory ideas simultaneously, that we approach these accounts with healthy skepticism, while also remaining open to the possibility that our current understanding of consciousness is incomplete, perhaps fundamentally wrong. Science progresses not by defending old certainties, but by following evidence into uncomfortable territories. And the evidence in these cases of apparent reincarnation, of memories that transcend death, continues to accumulate in ways that simple dismissal can no longer adequately address. So we begin with two sisters pointing at bloodstains only they can see, speaking words that should be impossible, remembering deaths that ended before their lives began. We begin with a question that has haunted humanity since the first human mind contemplated its own extinction. Does something essential survive when the body fails? And if it does, what horror and wonder does that survival carry with it into new flesh, new time, new existence? The answers waiting ahead are stranger than comfort allows, and more disturbing than imagination suggests. The morning of May the 5th, 1957, dawned clear and bright over the ancient market town of Hexham, Northumberland. Church bells began their familiar Sunday call across the rolling hills and stone-walled fields that had witnessed centuries of English history. In the Pollock household, a modest dwelling on a quiet residential street, Florence Pollock was preparing her 4 children for morning mass, smoothing down collars and checking that shoes were properly polished. It was a scene repeated in countless Catholic homes that morning, ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of peaceful domestic ritual that families assume will continue forever. None of them could have known that before the church bells finished their final peal, 2 of those children would be gone, and the Pollock family would be shattered in a way that no faith, no prayer, no desperate bargaining with God could immediately repair. 11-year-old Joanna was the eldest, a thoughtful girl with dark hair and serious eyes who took her responsibilities as big sister with the gravity that eldest children often do. She held 6-year-old Jacqueline's hand as they prepared to leave, making sure her little sister's coat was buttoned properly against the spring morning chill. The 2 girls were close in the way that siblings with a significant age gap sometimes are, Joanna protective and nurturing, Jacqueline adoring and eager to follow wherever her big sister led. 8-year-old Anthony was with them, and the baby of the family stayed home with their mother that morning. The 3 older children set off together, walking the familiar route they had traveled dozens of times before, the path to St. Mary's Catholic Church that wound through their neighborhood. John Pollock watched his daughters leave, perhaps remembering to call out a reminder to stay on the pavement, to watch for traffic, to be careful. He was a devout Catholic, a man whose faith ran deep and structured every aspect of his life. He worked as a milkman, rising before dawn most days to deliver bottles to doorsteps throughout Hexham, an honest living that supported his family, but left little room for luxury. His faith was not the casual Christianity of convenience, but something more profound, more consuming. He believed in the literal truth of Scripture, in miracles, in the resurrection of the body, in reincarnation as a manifestation of God's mysterious will. His beliefs had caused some tension even within his own marriage, as Florence, though equally devout, found some of her husband's more esoteric spiritual convictions difficult to accept. But on that Sunday morning, such theological discussions were distant concerns. The girls were going to church. What could be safer, more protected by Providence, than children walking to worship? The car came from nowhere, or so it seemed to the witnesses who would later give their statements to police, their voices still shaking with shock and horror. It was driven by a local woman, someone the community knew, which somehow made the tragedy even more terrible. She had been experiencing what she would later describe as a mental episode, her mind clouded by distress and confusion, her judgment catastrophically impaired. The vehicle mounted the pavement where the children walked, transforming in an instant from a mere machine into an instrument of destruction. The speed at impact was later calculated by investigators, but no technical measurement could capture the violent reality of metal and glass striking small bodies. The physics of momentum meeting fragility. Anthony survived, though he would carry the memory of those moments for the rest of his life. The sound and the sight of something no child should ever witness. Joanna and Jacqueline were killed almost instantly, their lives extinguished with a brutality and suddenness that defied comprehension. Witnesses ran from their homes, drawn by the terrible sound, finding a scene of devastation that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Someone covered the girls with coats and blankets, a futile gesture of dignity and care. Someone else ran to fetch the parents, a task no one could envy, the bearer of news that would split time itself into before and after. When John and Florence Pollock arrived at the scene, they entered a nightmare from which there would be no waking. Their daughters lay broken on the pavement of a quiet residential street, in a place where they should have been safe, where children should always be safe. The physical injuries were severe, the kind of trauma that could not be softened or explained away. Jacqueline had sustained a terrible wound to her forehead, a mark of the violence that had taken her life. Joanna bore injuries to her face and body that told the story of impact and catastrophe. Florence collapsed, her grief too enormous to be contained by a human frame. John stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him, the contradiction between what had been true moments before and what was true now. The following days passed in a blur of procedures and rituals designed to shepherd the bereaved through the immediate aftermath of loss. Police investigations, witness statements, the grim bureaucracy of death, certificates, and funeral arrangement. The driver was charged, though no legal consequence could balance the scales of what had been lost. The Catholic community of Hexham rallied around the Pollocks, bringing food, offering prayers, filling the house with the awkward presence of people who desperately wanted to help but had no power to change anything that mattered. The funeral was arranged for May the 10th, just 5 days after the accident, 5 days during which John and Florence existed in a state of shock, so profound it was almost a mercy. 2 small white coffins sat at the front of St. Mary's Church, the same church the girls had been walking to when they died. White coffins, the traditional choice for children, as if the color could somehow emphasize their innocence, could protest the unfairness of lives cut short before they had properly begun. The service was conducted in Latin, the old rite that would soon be replaced by vernacular reforms, but which still held sway in 1957. The priest spoke the ancient words of comfort and committal, but what comfort could there be? What words in any language could address the specific horror of burying 2 children at once, of choosing flowers for daughters who would never grow up, never marry, never have children of their own? Florence's grief was total and consuming, a darkness that threatened to swallow her whole. She held her surviving children close, terrified to let them out of her sight, knowing with terrible clarity how quickly the world could take them away. But John's grief took a different form, shaped by the particular nature of his faith and his personality. He could not accept that his daughters were simply gone, that their bright spirits had been extinguished like candles in the wind. His Catholic faith told him that their souls lived on, but that was not enough. His belief in reincarnation, a conviction that had seemed abstract and theoretical before, now became an obsession, a lifeline in drowning seas of grief. In the days and weeks following the funeral, John Pollock began to speak with absolute certainty about something that seemed impossible to everyone around him. His daughters would return to him, he insisted. They would be reborn. God would not leave him childless, would not allow such suffering without purpose or redemption. He prayed with an intensity that frightened his wife, bargaining with God, pleading for a miracle, convinced that his faith was being tested, and that if he believed hard enough, purely enough, desperately enough, the impossible would become possible. Florence listened to her husband's passionate declarations with a mixture of sympathy and concern. She wanted to believe, wanted to share his certainty, but the empty bedrooms in their house spoke a different truth. The clothes hanging in closets that would never be worn again, the toys gathering dust, the terrible silence where there had been laughter and arguing, and the chaos of children growing up. She worried about John's mental state, whether his mind had broken under the weight of grief, whether his obsession with reincarnation was a kind of madness born from unbearable loss. The community watched the Pollocks with pity and unease. Grief was understandable, but John's insistence that his daughters would be reborn seemed like denial taken to a dangerous extreme. The Catholic Church itself had no official position supporting reincarnation, and some worried that John was veering into heresy, constructing a personal theology of consolation that had no basis in doctrine. But who could blame a father for grasping at any hope, any possibility that might ease the torture of loss? The house remained heavy with absence. Every corner held memories. Every routine was disrupted by the missing pieces. Florence would set the table and find herself placing too many dishes, her hands remembering what her mind was trying to accept. Anthony struggled with survivor's guilt and trauma, a young boy trying to process the incomprehensible. The baby, too young to understand, would grow up knowing her sisters only through photographs and stories, ghosts who died before memory could anchor them. John continued to work his milk route, rising in the dark hours before dawn, delivering bottles to sleeping houses. But his mind was elsewhere, consumed with prayers and certainty. He began to tell anyone who would listen that his daughters were coming back. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally, physically. They would be reborn into his family. He knew this with a conviction that could not be shaken by doubt or reason, or the well-meaning concern of friends who worried he was losing his grip on reality. And then, impossibly, against all odds and rational expectation, Florence Pollock discovered she was pregnant. October 1958 began like any other autumn in Hexham, England. The leaves turned their familiar copper and gold, the morning mist settled over the Tyne Valley, and life proceeded with its customary rhythm. But on one particular day that month, something occurred that would challenge the very foundations of medical science and rational thought. John and Florence Pollock welcomed twin daughters into the world, two healthy baby girls they named Jennifer and Gillian. The delivery was unremarkable, the babies perfectly formed, and by all accounts, it should have been a moment of pure joy after the devastating tragedy that had struck their family just over a year earlier. But when the nurses first examined the newborns, they noticed something that made them pause, something that sent a chill through the delivery room despite the warmth of the heating lamps. Jennifer, the younger twin by several minutes, bore a distinctive mark on her forehead, just above her right eyebrow. A pale, slightly raised birthmark that curved in a peculiar crescent shape. The nurses exchanged glances. Florence Pollock went very still, because this was not just any birthmark. This was an exact replica of a scar that her deceased daughter Jacqueline had carried in the identical location. The medical staff tried to maintain their professional composure. Birthmarks are common, they assured the parents. Coincidences happen. But as they continued their examination of the twins, their clinical detachment began to waver. Gillian, the elder twin, had a distinct brown birthmark on her left waist, positioned just below her ribcage. The shape, the color, the precise location, all of it matched perfectly with a birthmark that had appeared on the body of Joanna Pollock, Florence and John's other daughter, who had died in the same accident that claimed Jacqueline's life. 2 daughters killed, 2 new daughters born, 2 identical birthmarks appearing in the exact same anatomical positions. Dr. Benjamin, the attending physician, had delivered hundreds of babies in his 30-year career. He had seen birthmarks of every conceivable shape and size, scattered across infant bodies in what seemed like nature's random artistry. Port wine stains, strawberry marks, cafe au lait spots, Mongolian spots, all variations of pigmentation and vascular formations that medical science could explain with reasonable certainty. But what he witnessed in that delivery room defied his experience. The probability of one birthmark matching a deceased sibling's distinctive mark was already astronomically low. The probability of 2 such matches, occurring simultaneously in twin girls, was something he could not begin to calculate. He documented everything with meticulous care. The position of Jennifer's forehead mark, 3 centimeters above the right eyebrow, extending 1.5 centimeters in length, curved at approximately 45 degrees. The exact measurements matched photographs of Jacqueline's scar from the accident. That scar had been caused by specific trauma, a wound inflicted during the violent collision that ended her life. It was not a natural birthmark, but an acquired injury. Yet here it was, replicated on her infant sister's skin, as though the flesh itself remembered. Gillian's waist mark was equally precise. Dr. Benjamin measured it at 2.2 centimeters in diameter, irregular in shape with a distinctive notch on the eastern edge, positioned 8 centimeters below the left ribcage and 3 centimeters anterior to the mid-axillary line. He pulled out the medical records from Joanna's last physical examination. The birthmark she had carried was documented in those files with the same measurements, the same positioning, the same irregular borders with that telltale notch. The doctor requested permission to photograph the marks. Florence agreed, though her hands trembled as she held her daughter's. The photographs were developed within days, stark black and white images that showed the marks in clinical detail. When placed beside photographs of Jacqueline and Joanna, the similarities became undeniable. Not approximate, not reminiscent. Identical. Dr. Benjamin shared the case with colleagues at Newcastle General Hospital. He presented it as a medical curiosity, a remarkable coincidence worthy of documentation. But in private conversations, away from the official channels and medical journals, he admitted his unease. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, a pediatric dermatologist who examined the twins at 6 weeks of age, later wrote in her personal notes that the case troubled her deeply. She had studied the genetic mechanisms behind birthmark formation, understood the interplay of melanocytes and blood vessels during fetal development. Nothing in her training explained this level of precision. Birthmarks typically result from random cellular events during gestation. Clusters of pigment cells, malformed blood vessels, localized variations in skin development. They follow no pattern, respect no family history, and certainly do not replicate the acquired scars of deceased relatives. Genetic birthmarks like the Mongolian spots common in certain populations could be passed down through generations, but these appeared in predictable patterns across many family members. What Dr. Whitmore observed in the Pollock twins was different. These were not hereditary marks passed through DNA. These were precise duplications of specific individual characteristics, one of which had been caused by external trauma, not genetic coding. She examined Jennifer's forehead mark under magnification. The tissue showed no signs of injury or scar formation. It was congenital, present from birth, formed during fetal development. Yet it matched the dimensions and shape of a traumatic scar with impossible accuracy. The mark contained slightly more melanin than the surrounding skin, giving it a pale brown color that stood out against Jennifer's fair complexion. Under certain lights, it almost seemed to shimmer, as though something beneath the surface was different, altered at a fundamental level. Gillian's waist mark proved equally perplexing. Dr. Whitmore took tissue samples with the parents' consent, examining the cells for any unusual properties. The results showed normal skin cells, normal pigmentation, normal vascular structure. Everything was precisely as it should be in a common café au lait birthmark, except for the location, except for the shape, except for the impossible coincidence that it matched her dead sister's mark down to the millimeter. The medical community, when presented with these findings, defaulted to the only rational explanation available: coincidence. Remarkable, certainly. Worthy of documentation, absolutely. But ultimately, just a statistical anomaly in a universe filled with unlikely events. After all, given enough births, enough families, enough children, eventually such a coincidence must occur. The mathematics of probability suggested that somewhere, sometime, twins would be born with birthmarks that happened to match deceased siblings. But the mathematics also suggested how breathtakingly unlikely such an occurrence would be. Dr. Michael Hendricks, a geneticist brought in to consult on the case, attempted to calculate the odds. He factored in the frequency of birthmarks in the general population. Approximately 80% of infants show some form of pigmented mark. He considered the variety of locations where such marks appear, distributed across the entire surface area of human skin. He calculated the range of possible shapes, sizes, and colorations. Then he tried to determine the probability of two specific marks appearing in two specific locations on two separate individuals born to the same parents. His initial calculations suggested odds of approximately 1 in several billion. But that was for random birthmarks in random positions. When he factored in the requirement that these marks must match the exact characteristics of 2 specific deceased children, including one mark that replicated a traumatic scar rather than a natural birthmark, the numbers became meaningless. The probability fell into ranges so remote that they effectively meant impossible. Not difficult, not unlikely. Statistically impossible within any reasonable framework of chance. Yet there the marks were, photographed, measured, and documented by multiple physicians. Physical evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. The twins carried these marks on their skin like signatures, like identification tags linking them to the sisters who had died. John Pollock, the father, had his own interpretation. A deeply religious man, he had prayed fervently after losing Jacqueline and Joanna. He had asked God for his daughters back, for a second chance, for mercy in the face of unbearable grief. When Florence became pregnant with twins just months after the accident, John believed his prayers had been answered. The birthmarks, in his view, were proof, physical evidence that his daughters had returned to him, reborn into new bodies, but carrying the marks of their previous lives. The medical professionals tried to counsel him against this belief. They spoke of grief, of the mind's need to find meaning in tragedy, of the dangers of projecting such expectations onto innocent children. But John remained unmoved. He had seen the marks. He had measured them himself, compared them to photographs, traced their outlines with his finger. This was not wishful thinking or religious delusion. This was evidence written in flesh. Florence was less certain. She wanted to believe, wanted to think that somehow, impossibly, her lost daughters had come back to her. But she also feared what such a belief might mean, what burden it might place on these new children to live up to memories of the dead. She held Jennifer and Gillian close, studying their tiny faces, searching for answers that would not come. The photographs taken during those first weeks remained in the family's possession for a decade. Black and white images showing infant skin marked with patterns that defied explanation. Medical journals occasionally referenced the case in articles about unusual birthmark presentations, always with careful language that avoided any suggestion of the paranormal. The twins from Hexham, with the remarkable coincidental marks, a curiosity, an anomaly, a footnote in medical literature. But for those who actually examined the evidence, who held the photographs side by side, who traced the measurements and confirmed the impossible precision, the clinical language felt insufficient. Something more than coincidence had occurred in that delivery room in October 1958. Something that medical science could document but not explain. The birthmarks were real, physical, undeniable. They existed in the world of flesh and blood, of cells and tissue, of measurable, observable reality. And yet they should not have existed at all. The morning air in Hexham carried the scent of wet stone and coal smoke when the Pollock family's car rolled into town in 1959. John and Florence Pollock had left this market town in Northumberland shortly after their twin daughters were born, seeking a fresh start in Whitley Bay after the devastating loss of their older daughters. Now, 4 years later, circumstances had drawn them back. What they could not have anticipated was what would happen when Jennifer and Gillian stepped out of that car onto streets they had supposedly never seen. Florence noticed it first. The girls had been unusually quiet during the drive, pressing their small faces against the windows as the landscape shifted from coastal flatlands to the rolling hills surrounding Hexham. But it wasn't the typical curiosity of children glimpsing new territory. There was something else in their expressions, something Florence would later describe as recognition. The kind of look that crosses a person's face when they're returning home after a long absence, not discovering a place for the very first time. Jennifer pointed through the window as they drove down the main street. She was 4 years old, barely tall enough to see over the door panel without standing on the seat. Her finger touched the glass with certainty. "That's our school," she said. Not a question. A statement. Florence felt her husband's hands tighten on the steering wheel. Their older daughters, Joanna and Jacqueline, had attended a school in Hexham. But Jennifer and Gillian had never been here. They had been born in this town, yes, but the family had moved away when the twins were mere infants. These children had no conscious memories of Hexham. They could not possibly recognize anything. "What did you say, love?" Florence asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. She glanced at her husband, but John's eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. His jaw was set in that particular way that meant he was thinking hard about something he didn't want to discuss. "That's where we went to school," Gillian added, her voice carrying that matter-of-fact tone that children use when stating the obvious. "We used to play in the yard during break time." The building they indicated was indeed the school Joanna and Jacqueline had attended. Florence had walked her older daughters there countless times, holding their hands as they crossed the street, listening to them chatter about their lessons and their friends. The memory of it made her throat tighten. But these were different children. These girls had never been inside that building, never played in that yard, never walked these streets holding her hand. John pulled the car to the curb, needing a moment. They sat in silence, the engine ticking as it cooled. Through the windscreen, Hexham looked exactly as they had left it. The same gray stone buildings, the same narrow streets climbing up from the valley, the same heavy sky promising rain. Nothing had changed, except that their daughters who should have been here were gone, and these two children who had never been here seemed to know it intimately. "Let's take a walk," John said finally. His voice sounded strange, hollow. "Stretch our legs before we go to the new house." "No." They had rented a place on the other side of town, nowhere near their old residence. A deliberate choice, Florence had thought at the time. A way to make this move feel less like returning to a place of tragedy, and more like starting somewhere genuinely new. But as they walked through the streets, with Jennifer and Gillian between them, that hope began to crumble. The girls walked with purpose, not the wandering, distractible ambling typical of 4-year-olds, but with direction. They turned down side streets before their parents suggested it, navigated around corners as if following a familiar route. When John deliberately started to turn the wrong way down a lane, Gillian tugged at his hand. "No, Daddy," she said patiently, as if correcting a simple mistake. "That way doesn't go through. You have to go round." She was right. The lane was a dead end, blocked by a wall that had stood there for decades. John stared down at his daughter, this small child in her blue coat and white socks, and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had forgotten about that wall, hadn't thought about this particular street in years. But Gillian, who had never been here, knew. They continued walking. Florence found herself testing them, though she immediately felt guilty for it. These were her children, not subjects in some cruel experiment. But she couldn't help herself. She wanted to understand. Needed to understand. "I wonder where the old sweet shop is," she said aloud, as if thinking to herself. "The one that sold those lemon drops Joanna liked." "It's on the next street," Jennifer said immediately, pointing. "Next to the shop with the blue door." She was precisely correct. Every detail. The sweet shop stood exactly where Jennifer indicated. And yes, the neighboring shop had a blue door. Florence had taken Joanna and Jacqueline there regularly, a special treat on Saturday afternoons. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. Donaldson, had always slipped an extra sweet into the bag for each girl. But Mrs. Donaldson had never met Jennifer and Gillian. These twins had never tasted those lemon drops, never pushed open that shop door, never pressed their noses against the glass jars of colorful candies. The phenomenon intensified as they walked deeper into the old neighborhood. The girls began volunteering information unprompted. They pointed out a garden where we used to pick flowers, a wall where we sat and ate our lunch, a corner where the big dog lived that barked at everyone. Each statement was verifiable. Each memory belonged to Joanna and Jacqueline. Each recollection came from lives these children had never lived. Other residents began to notice. Mrs. Stevenson, who had lived next door to the Pollocks in their old house, was tending her front garden when the family passed. She straightened up, trowel in hand, her face cycling through confusion and something close to fear. She knew the Pollocks had moved away after the accident. She knew about the twins born afterward. But seeing them here, in this place, seemed to violate some natural order she couldn't name. "Mrs. Pollock," she called out uncertainly. "Is that you?" Before Florence could respond, Gillian waved enthusiastically. "Hello, Mrs. Stevenson. Do you still have those pink roses in your back garden? The ones that smell like perfume?" The trowel fell from the elderly woman's hand. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. The roses Gillian described were indeed in her back garden, not visible from the street. Joanna and Jacqueline had been allowed to play in Mrs. Stevenson's garden occasionally, had been shown those very roses, had been permitted to smell them. But these children, these impossible children, had never set foot in that garden, had never been shown anything. Mrs. Stevenson made an excuse and retreated into her house. Florence saw the curtain twitch as they walked past, the old woman watching from behind the glass. She couldn't blame her. She felt the same creeping dread, the same sense that something fundamental about the world had shifted and revealed an aspect of reality that should have remained hidden. Then they turned onto Elm Street, and both girls stopped walking simultaneously. Their hands, which had been swinging freely, suddenly clutched tighter to their parents' fingers. Jennifer's breath caught in a small gasp. Gillian's eyes went very wide. "That's our house," Jennifer whispered. She wasn't pointing now. She was staring straight ahead at a modest terraced house with a green door and white lace curtains in the windows. "That's where we lived. Number 14. It was number 14. The Pollock's old home, where Joanna and Jacqueline had spent their short lives, where Florence had cooked meals and tucked her daughters into bed and read them stories, where she had kissed them goodbye on the morning they died, never imagining it would be the last time. Another family lived there now. The curtains were different, the door had been repainted, but it was unmistakably the same house. John's face had gone pale. He started to steer the girls away, to move past the house and continue their walk. But Gillian pulled against his hand. Not fighting, just resistant, her feet planted on the pavement. "Can we go see the playground?" she asked. Her voice was smaller now, uncertain in a way it hadn't been before. "The one with the swings and the slide?" Florence felt her heart stop. The playground. The place where it had happened. Where a car had mounted the curb and stolen her daughters away in seconds. The place that still visited her nightmares with the sound of screaming and the image of small bodies on the ground. They had deliberately avoided mentioning it, had tried never to speak of it in front of the twins. And yet, here was Gillian, asking to see it as casually as she might ask for a glass of milk. "How do you know about the playground?" John asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended, sharp with emotion he was struggling to contain. Both girls looked up at him with those wide, dark eyes. Jennifer answered, her tone suggesting the question was strange. "We used to play there all the time, Daddy. Don't you remember? We liked the swings best. The high ones that made your tummy feel funny." Joanna had loved those swings. She would pump her legs for what felt like hours, flying higher and higher, laughing with pure joy. Jacqueline had been more cautious, preferring the lower, safer arc, but she'd been on those swings too. They both had. But Jennifer and Gillian had not. Could not have been. The walk to the playground happened in a daze. Florence felt disconnected from her own body, as if she were watching the scene unfold from a great distance. The girls led the way now, turning down streets with absolute confidence, navigating the route they had supposedly never traveled. Other residents saw them passing. Word spread quickly in small towns. The Pollocks were back. Those twins were back. And people began to whisper. Mr. Harrison, who ran the corner shop, stood in his doorway watching them pass. He had given a statement to the police after the accident, had been one of the witnesses to the tragedy that had shaken Hexham. Now he watched these two little girls walk by, chattering to each other about the fastest way to reach the playground, and his face showed a mixture of wonder and horror that Florence would remember for the rest of her life. When they reached the playground, both girls ran ahead, their earlier hesitation forgotten. They went straight to the swings, the same swings where their sisters had played on that terrible day. They climbed onto the seats with practiced ease and began to swing, their legs pumping in unison, their faces tilted toward the gray sky. For a moment watching them, Florence could almost see Joanna and Jacqueline there instead. The image overlaid itself on reality. Two sets of daughters occupying the same space, separated by the thinnest membrane between life and death. John stood beside her, his hand finding hers. Neither of them spoke. What was there to say? Their daughters, who had never been to this town, had led them unerringly to the exact spot where their other daughters had died. They had named streets they had never walked, identified houses they had never entered, recalled details they could not possibly know. And they had done it all with the casual certainty of children remembering yesterday, not the grave certainty of children claiming to remember a previous life. That was perhaps the most unsettling aspect. There was no drama in their recognition, no sense that they understood they were doing anything unusual. To Jennifer and Gillian, this was simply memory. Simple, ordinary, impossible memory. As they watched the girls swing higher and higher, laughing in the afternoon light, Florence wondered what it meant. What did it say about death? About consciousness? About the nature of identity itself? Were these her daughters returned, somehow, inexplicably? Or were they new souls who had somehow absorbed the memories of the children who came before? The questions spiraled endlessly, offering no answers, only deeper mystery. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon when they finally called the girls down from the swings. Jennifer and Gillian came reluctantly, their cheeks flushed from exercise and excitement. As they walked back toward the car, back toward their new house in a town that was somehow not new at all, Gillian took her mother's hand and looked up with those knowing eyes. "We're happy to be home, Mummy," she said simply. And Florence, despite the fear and confusion and wonder churning inside her, couldn't help but believe her. Florence Pollock had seen many things in her life, but nothing prepared her for the afternoon when the past reached out and seized her daughters with invisible hands. It was an ordinary day, the kind that makes you believe the world is safe and predictable. The twins were playing in the front garden, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. They were 4 years old now, healthy and vibrant, so utterly alive that it almost hurt to watch them. Florence was hanging washing on the line, half listening to their chatter, when she heard the sound of an engine in the distance. The car was still far down the road, just a neighbor returning home, moving at a modest speed through the quiet residential street. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing threatening. Just another vehicle on just another afternoon in Hexham. But something changed in the air, something Florence felt before she could understand it. The twins' playful voices cut off abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Then came the screaming. It was not the cry of children who had scraped a knee or been frightened by a bee. This was something older, something that came from a place deep in the human soul where terror lives in its purest form. Jennifer saw the car first, her small body going rigid, as though she had been turned to stone. Her eyes, those same gray-green eyes that had belonged to Jacqueline, went wide with recognition. Not just fear, recognition. The car. Jennifer's voice tore from her throat, high and desperate, and filled with a knowing that no 4-year-old should possess. The car is coming to get us. Gillian's head snapped toward the sound, toward the vehicle that was still hundreds of feet away, still moving slowly, still utterly harmless to anyone watching with rational eyes. But Gillian was not watching with rational eyes. She was seeing something else entirely, something that existed in a moment 11 months before she was born, in a timeline she should have had no access to. Her scream joined her sister's, and together their voices created a sound that Florence would describe years later as the sound of children dying. Florence dropped the wet sheet she had been holding and ran toward her daughters, her heart hammering against her ribs. What she saw made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. The twins had grabbed each other with a desperate, practiced precision that spoke of muscle memory older than their body. Jennifer clutched Gillian exactly as witnesses had described Joanna clutching Jacqueline in those final seconds before impact. Their small arms wrapped around each other in a specific configuration, a protective embrace that Florence had never taught them, had never described to them, had deliberately kept from them because what mother wants to tell her children how their sisters died? But they knew. Somehow, impossibly, they knew. The twins were backing away from the approaching car, their movements synchronized in a way that went beyond the normal twin connection. They moved as one organism, one entity trying desperately to escape a fate they had already lived through. Their feet stumbled over each other as they retreated toward the garden wall, still screaming, still clutching each other with white-knuckled intensity. The terror on their faces was not the fear of imagination. It was the terror of memory, of recognition, of knowing exactly what comes next. Florence reached them just as the car passed by, the driver completely unaware of the drama unfolding in the garden, unaware that his simple journey home had somehow opened a door between worlds. She gathered both girls into her arms, feeling them trembling against her, their small hearts beating like trapped birds. They were still screaming, though the car had gone, though the danger, such as it was, had passed. But for Jennifer and Gillian, the danger had not passed. The danger was happening, was always happening, would always be happening in some eternal present tense where death comes on four wheels. Florence carried them inside, their bodies rigid with fear, and tried to comfort them with soft words and gentle touches. But they were unreachable, lost in something she could not see, could not touch, could not fight. She held them on the sofa, rocking them as she had when they were babies, waiting for the storm to pass. And slowly, gradually, the screaming subsided into sobbing, and the sobbing into whimpering, and the whimpering into a terrible, heavy silence. It was in this silence that Jennifer, still wrapped in her mother's arms, turned to look at Gillian. The expression on her face was one that Florence had never seen on a child before. It was tender and tragic and infinitely sad, the look of someone who has witnessed unbearable suffering and carries the weight of that witnessing. Jennifer reached out with one small hand and touched her sister's temple, her fingers gentle and precise, finding a specific spot above Gillian's right eye. What Jennifer said next would become one of the most documented and disturbing pieces of evidence in the entire Pollock case. Her voice was soft now, almost calm, but it carried a certainty that made Florence's skin prickle with goosebumps. It was the voice of a child, yes, but it spoke with the authority of experience, of having been there, of having seen what no one should see. "The blood's coming out of your eyes," Jennifer said, her fingers still resting against Gillian's temple. "That's where the car hit you." Florence felt the world tilt beneath her. The room seemed to contract and expand simultaneously, reality bending under the weight of what she was hearing. She had never told the twins about the injuries, never described the impact points, the trauma, the specific locations where metal had met flesh and bone. She and John had agreed, absolutely and without question, that the girls should be spared those details. If they were going to speak about Joanna and Jacqueline at all, it would be in gentle terms, in soft-edged memories that did not include the mechanics of their deaths. Yet, here was Jennifer, 4 years old, describing with perfect accuracy where the car had struck Jacqueline. The medical reports had documented it precisely. The primary impact point was to the right temple, just above the eye, exactly where Jennifer's small fingers now rested on her sister's head. It was the blow that had caused the catastrophic brain injury, the injury that meant Jacqueline never regained consciousness, never had a chance to say goodbye. Gillian stared at her sister with wide eyes, and Florence saw something pass between them, some communication that happened below the level of words. Gillian did not question what Jennifer said. She did not ask what she meant or why she would say such a thing. She simply nodded, a tiny movement of understanding, and fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. She knew too. Whatever Jennifer was experiencing, whatever nightmare reality she was trapped in, Gillian understood it from the inside. This was not the last time the twins would react to vehicles with inexplicable terror. Over the following months and years, the pattern would repeat with variations, but always with the same core elements. The primal fear, the protective clutching, the specific positioning of their bodies that matched witness descriptions of their sister's final moments. Other cars would trigger the response, though never with quite the same intensity as that first time. Sometimes just the sound of an engine would be enough to make them freeze, their small bodies going tense, their eyes scanning for danger that existed in another timeline. They developed what any modern psychologist would recognize as a profound and specific phobia, but the particulars of it defied easy explanation. They were not simply afraid of cars in general, not afraid of traffic in the way that children who had been taught about road safety might be cautious. Their fear was targeted, specific, tied to certain triggers that seemed to connect directly to the circumstances of the accident that killed Joanna and Jacqueline. Fast-moving vehicles provoked the strongest reactions, particularly when the twins were together and on foot near a road. It was as though their bodies remembered the vulnerability of being small and exposed, of being in the path of something larger and unstoppable. Florence noticed that the fear was worse when they were holding hands, as if the physical connection between them completed some circuit that allowed the memory to flow more freely. She began to understand that she was watching something far more complex than simple fear. She was watching trauma, watching her daughters relive an experience that by all rational measures they had never lived through in the first place. John documented these incidents with his characteristic precision, noting dates and times, describing the twins' reactions in careful detail. He was building a case, gathering evidence for Dr. Stevenson and for anyone else who might study the phenomena. But Florence was living it, day by day, moment by moment, watching her daughters struggle with terrors that should not have belonged to them. She saw how they comforted each other afterward, how Jennifer would hold Gillian and whisper things too soft for Florence to hear, how Gillian would rest her head against Jennifer's shoulder in a gesture of absolute trust. The protective dynamic between them was striking and constant. Jennifer, who carried Jacqueline's memories, who had been the older sister before, naturally assumed the role of protector. Even in their terror, even in the midst of their screaming panic, Jennifer positioned herself between Gillian and the perceived threat. Her small body, barely 3 feet tall, would try to shield her sister from the approaching vehicle, just as Joanna had tried to shield Jacqueline in those final seconds on Whittenstall Lane. Florence found herself wondering what it meant, this repetition of protective instinct, this echo of love that transcended death. If the twins were indeed Joanna and Jacqueline returned, then they had died once trying to save each other, and were still, in some fundamental way, trying to complete that act of protection. The love had survived. The bond had survived. But so had the trauma. And perhaps that was the terrible price of continuity, of consciousness that persisted beyond the grave. The neighbors began to whisper, of course. Word spread through Hexham about the Pollock twins and their strange affliction, their uncanny fear. Some viewed it as proof of John's claims, evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. Others found more prosaic explanations, though none that quite fit the specifics of what Florence and John were observing. Perhaps the twins had overheard something, absorbed details without their parents realizing. Perhaps they were simply anxious children, their fear a product of their father's obsession with their dead sisters. But Florence knew what she had seen. She had watched Jennifer's face as she touched Gillian's temple, had heard the certainty in her voice. She had felt the way the twins' bodies locked together in that specific configuration, that exact embrace. This was not learned behavior. This was not something a child could fabricate or absorb through ambient information. This was memory written in the body itself, trauma encoded in muscles and nerves, and some deeper structure that survived the transition between lives. The blood's coming out of your eyes. That's where the car hit you. The words would echo in Florence's mind for the rest of her life, a testament to something that defied every comfortable assumption about how the world worked. Her daughters were carrying wounds from a death they had never died, crying tears for an impact they had never felt, protecting each other from a danger that had already claimed them once before. And all Florence could do was hold them through it, witness it, and try to understand what it meant that love and terror could both survive the impossible journey from one life to the next. The morning light filtered through the windows of the Pollock home in Hexham as John and Florence prepared to show their young daughters something they had kept hidden for years. The twins were 4 years old now, Jennifer and Gillian, born exactly 18 months after tragedy had stolen their first 2 daughters from them. The box of toys had remained in the attic, untouched, wrapped in old blankets and memories, too painful to revisit. But recently, something had changed. The twins had begun saying things, doing things, that made the hair stand up on the back of Florence's neck. And so, on this particular morning in 1961, the parents made a decision that would alter their understanding of reality forever. They brought the box down and placed it in the center of the living room floor. Neither Jennifer nor Gillian had ever seen these belongings. The family had moved to a different house after the accident. These were toys from a different home, a different life, packed away before the twins were even born. Florence's hands trembled slightly as she opened the cardboard flaps, revealing the contents inside. Dolls with faded dresses, a small toy xylophone with chipped paint, colored blocks worn smooth by small hands that no longer existed in this world. The reaction was immediate and inexplicable. Jennifer lunged forward with a possessiveness that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her 4 years of existence. She grabbed a particular doll, a rag doll with brown yarn hair and a green checkered dress, and clutched it to her chest. The words that came out of her mouth made Florence's blood run cold. "Mine," Jennifer said with absolute certainty. "This is mine. This is my Mary." Neran said the doll had indeed belonged to Joanna. And yes, Joanna had called it Mary. But that name had never been spoken in the twins' presence. Florence was certain of this. The name Mary wasn't written on the doll. There were no photographs labeled with the doll's name. It was simply what Joanna had chosen to call her favorite toy, a private piece of information from a dead child's inner world. Before Florence could even process this, Gillian reached into the box with equal determination. Her small fingers closed around a different doll, one with a porcelain face and a blue knitted sweater. She pulled it close and looked up at her mother with eyes that seemed, for just a moment, far older than they should have been. "My baby," Gillian announced. "I've been looking for my baby." That doll had been Jacqueline's constant companion. She had carried it everywhere, called it her baby, treated it with a tenderness unusual for a child so young. Jacqueline had been the gentler of the two sisters, the one who needed protection, who followed in Joanna's shadow. And now here was Gillian, the younger twin by 10 minutes, claiming Jacqueline's beloved toy as if no time had passed at all, as if death were merely a brief interruption in ownership. John Pollock stood in the doorway, watching this scene unfold with a mixture of vindication and terror. He had believed from the beginning that something inexplicable was happening with his daughters. He had studied the birthmarks, documented the fears, noted every strange comment and behavior. But this was different. This was evidence of a kind that even Florence, who had resisted his theories, could not easily dismiss. The twins divided the toys with perfect, unerring accuracy. Every single item Jennifer claimed had belonged to Joanna. Every toy Gillian selected had been Jacqueline's dad. There was no hesitation, no trial and error. They sorted through the box as though reclaiming their own possessions after a long absence. A red plastic car went to Jennifer, Joanna's favorite vehicle for racing across the kitchen floor. A stuffed rabbit went to Gillian, the one Jacqueline had slept with every night. A small wooden box with a broken hinge went to Jennifer. A set of colored pencils went to Gillian. But it was the names that truly defied explanation. The secret names, the private language of childhood play that parents overhear but rarely remember with precision. Jennifer picked up a small teddy bear and called it Teddy Boo. Florence felt her knees weaken. She had forgotten that name entirely, but as soon as she heard it, the memory surfaced. Joanna had indeed called that bear Teddy Boo. The name had made no particular sense, just the kind of nonsense designation children create, but it had been consistent. It had been real. Gillian, meanwhile, was having a conversation with her porcelain doll. She was calling it Susan and scolding it gently for being naughty. Susan... ... The name floated up from Florence's memory, like something from a dream. Yes, Jacqueline had called that doll Susan. How could Gillian possibly know that? That evening, while the twins played contentedly with their newly reclaimed treasures, Florence went to the back of the bedroom closet and retrieved something she had not looked at in years: her journals. She had kept detailed diaries during her first daughter's lives, recording milestones and moments, the kinds of things mothers write down intending to preserve but often never read again. Her hands shook as she turned the pages, searching for confirmation. There it was, in her own handwriting from 1956. Joanna has named her new doll Mary and insists it must sleep in her bed. And further on, from several months later, Jackie won't go anywhere without her baby doll. She started calling it Susan and gets very upset if we call it anything else. Désolé. The journals confirmed every name the twins had spoken. Names that had never been mentioned in their presence. Names that Florence herself had forgotten until this moment of verification. The odds of guessing correctly, of random chance producing this perfect correlation, seemed to approach impossibility. But the object recognition was only one layer of the phenomenon. In the days and weeks that followed, the twins' play patterns began to reveal something even more complex. Their relationship dynamics, the way they interacted with each other, started to mirror precisely the dynamic that had existed between Joanna and Jacqueline. Jennifer became increasingly protective of Gillian, but in a specific way. She was bossy, commanding, always telling her sister what to do and how to do it. This wasn't typical older sibling behavior, because Jennifer was only minutes older, and until this point, the twins had been relatively equal in their relationship. But now Jennifer took charge with an authority that seemed borrowed from someone else's experience. She directed their games, decided the rules, corrected Gillian when she did things wrong. "Not like that," Jennifer would say. taking a toy from Gillian's hands. "You have to do it this way. I'll show you." Joanna had been exactly this way with Jacqueline. Bossy but loving, protective but controlling. She had been the leader, the decision-maker, the one who spoke for both of them when adults asked questions. Jacqueline had been content to follow, to let her older sister navigate the world while she trailed behind, secure in that protection. And now, impossibly, this same pattern was reasserting itself. Gillian accepted Jennifer's authority without question. She looked to her sister for guidance, waited for permission, sought approval. When they played together, Gillian was always the follower, Jennifer always the leader. The birth order, those mere 10 minutes between them, seemed irrelevant compared to this deeper template of relationship that was expressing itself through them. Florence watched this unfold with growing unease. She began to see her dead daughters in the movements and voices of her living ones. The way Jennifer tilted her head when she was being authoritative. The way Gillian sought comfort by holding onto her sister's sleeve. These were echoes of behaviors she had witnessed before, in different bodies, in a different time. It was during this period that Dr. Ian Stevenson entered the picture. John Pollock had been writing to researchers, documenting everything, desperate to have someone take his observations seriously. Stevenson, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, had begun investigating cases of children who claimed memories of previous lives. He was one of the few academics willing to approach these phenomena with rigorous methodology, rather than immediate dismissal. Stevenson arrived in Hexham with his notebooks and his tape recorder, a serious man with a scientist's caution and an investigator's persistence. He interviewed the parents separately, ensuring their accounts were independent and consistent. He examined the birthmarks on the twins, photographing them, measuring them, comparing their locations to the scars and marks the deceased sisters had carried. He reviewed Florence's journals, verifying dates and details. He observed the twins at play, noting their interactions, recording their spontaneous statements. What impressed Stevenson was not any single piece of evidence but the cumulative weight of it all. The birthmarks that corresponded to injuries, the phobias that matched the circumstances of death, the object recognition that defied statistical probability, the knowledge of private names that had never been transmitted by normal means, the behavioral patterns that replicated a previous relationship. He documented it all with meticulous care. His approach was neither credulous nor dismissive. He looked for alternative explanations, considered the possibility of unconscious cueing from parents, examined whether the twins could have overheard conversations or seen photographs. But the evidence resisted these simpler interpretations. The parents had been careful, even skeptical. The twins' knowledge was too specific, too detailed, too accurate. In his notes, Stevenson wrote about the quality of the twins' recognition of the toys. It was not hesitant or uncertain. It was immediate and proprietary. They did not guess. They knew. And this knowing appeared to exist independent of anything they could have learned through normal channels of information. The case of the Pollock twins would become one of the most extensively documented in Stevenson's research. He would follow up with the family over years, tracking the evolution of the memories and behaviors. And while he remained cautious in his conclusions, never claiming absolute proof, he found the case compelling enough to include in his academic publications, presenting it as evidence worthy of serious consideration. For John and Florence, Stevenson's involvement brought a strange kind of relief. Their experience was being taken seriously, examined with scientific rigor, treated as something other than delusion or grief-induced fantasy. The eerie atmosphere that had settled over their household now had a framework, a context within which it might be understood. But understanding did not make it less unsettling. Every time Jennifer scolded Gillian in that particular tone, every time the twins arranged their dolls in a configuration Florence recognized from years past, the boundary between past and present seemed to shimmer and grow thin. The dead were not quite gone. The living were not quite who they appeared to be. And in the space between, something inexplicable continued to unfold. Jennifer and Gillian Pollock were barely 5 years old when their parents first noticed the silences. Not the comfortable quiet of children at play, but something heavier, more uncertain. The moments when they would pause mid-sentence, searching for words that had come so easily just months before. Florence Pollock would find Gillian staring at the old photographs on the mantel, her small face creased in concentration, as though trying to recognize people she should know, but somehow didn't. The girls would start to mention something about the park or the old school, or that special walk down the hill, then stop, confused, the memory evaporating even as they reached for it. It began so gradually that the Pollocks almost didn't notice at first. John kept meticulous notes in his journal, documenting each recognition, each spontaneous memory, each moment of inexplicable knowledge. In the autumn of 1962, when the twins were 4.5, he noted that Gillian had spontaneously mentioned the swing at the park without any prompting. By the following spring, she could no longer remember having said it. The entries in his journal grew shorter, more uncertain. Where once he had filled pages with detailed accounts of the twins' recognitions and fears, now he wrote brief observations punctuated by question marks. Had Jennifer actually recognized Mrs. Henderson at the market, or had she simply been friendly? When Gillian cried at the sight of a car coming around the corner, was it genuine terror rooted in another life's memory, or just the normal anxiety of a cautious child? Florence noticed it in different ways. The birthmarks that had seemed so significant, those matching marks on Gillian's body that corresponded exactly to Jacqueline's scars, they were still there, of course. The body keeps its mysterious map, but Gillian no longer touched them with that strange knowingness, no longer seemed to carry in her small frame the weight of having lived before. The doll that Jennifer had claimed as her own, the one that had belonged to Jacqueline, became just another toy among many. The possessiveness faded. The special significance dissolved like morning fog. Dr. Ian Stevenson visited the Pollock family again in 1963 and documented what he would later term the predictable fading of reincarnation memories. He had seen it before in other cases, this slow dissolution that seemed to follow a pattern as reliable as the seasons. In his research across cultures and continents, he found that children who spoke of previous lives typically began between the ages of 2 and 4. Their memories would be most vivid and detailed during this window. But somewhere between 5 and 8 years old, the memories would begin to fade, becoming fragmented, confused, and eventually vanishing almost entirely. Stevenson proposed several theories for this phenomenon. The first was neurological. As the brain develops and matures, as new neural pathways form and strengthen with each new experience, the old patterns, those mysterious imprints from before, would naturally be overwritten. Childhood amnesia, that common inability to remember our earliest years, might work in tandem with this process. We remember so little from before age 3 or 4, anyway. Perhaps what the twins were losing wasn't extraordinary at all, just the normal forgetting that claims all of our earliest experiences, except that what they were forgetting happened to be memories of different lives entirely. His second theory centered on identity formation. To become Jennifer and Gillian, fully and completely, perhaps they had to stop being Jacqueline and Joanna. Identity is a jealous thing. It demands singular attention, complete commitment. A child building her sense of self, discovering who she is in the world, creating the narrative that will carry her through life, cannot afford to be fragmented across 2 existences. The new identity grows stronger, puts down deeper roots, and the old one, lacking the reinforcement of current experience, withers away. The twins were making friends who had never known their older sisters. They were having experiences entirely their own. They were becoming themselves, and in that becoming, the borrowed memories had to retreat. Dr. Hernani Guimarães Andrade, a Brazilian parapsychologist who corresponded with Stevenson, suggested a third possibility. Perhaps the memories didn't fade at all but simply became inaccessible, locked away in some deep chamber of consciousness. Under hypnosis, some adults who had spoken of past lives as children could access fragments of those early memories again. The information wasn't destroyed, merely sealed off, protected perhaps from the confusion and psychological turmoil that might result from carrying 2 sets of life experiences simultaneously. The conscious mind, merciful in its way, draws a curtain across what it cannot integrate. For John and Florence Pollock, watching this dissolution was excruciating in ways they hadn't anticipated. They had prayed for this, hadn't they? Prayed for their little girls to be free from the burden of impossible memories, free from the trauma of reliving a death that wasn't theirs to carry. Florence had spent sleepless nights worrying about Jennifer's nightmares, about the way fear would suddenly flood Gillian's face when she saw cars. She had wanted nothing more than for her daughters to be normal children, unburdened, light, free. And yet, when it came, that freedom felt like another kind of loss. Florence would later tell a researcher that it was like losing Jacqueline and Joanna all over again. But slower this time, more insidious. The first time had been sudden, violent, absolute. The car hitting them, the funeral, the terrible finality of it. But this second loss happened in degrees. A recognition not made, a fear that no longer surfaced, a name forgotten. Each small fade was another goodbye, another loosening of the thread that had connected them across the boundary of death. John struggled with it differently. His faith had told him this would happen, had given him the framework to understand it. The soul moves on, takes on new form, new purpose. The old life recedes because it must, but his heart ached anyway. There had been moments, precious and strange, when he felt he had all four of his daughters in the room with him. When Jennifer would laugh in exactly Jacqueline's way, or when Gillian would tilt her head with Joanna's characteristic gesture, he felt the impossible had been granted to him. A second chance, a glimpse beyond the veil. And now that glimpse was closing, the curtain falling, the mystery sealing itself away. By the time the twins turned 7 in October of 1965, it was essentially complete. They remembered having remembered, if that makes sense. They knew from family stories that they had once said strange things, recognized places they shouldn't have known, displayed fears they had no reason to carry. But the actual content of those memories was gone. Gillian knew she had once been terrified of cars, but couldn't access the why of it anymore. Jennifer understood that she had claimed certain toys and places as her own, but the feeling of ownership, that deep recognition, had evaporated. Florence packed away John's journals, those careful documentations of the impossible. She tucked the photographs of Jacqueline and Joanna into albums that would be looked at sometimes, but not displayed daily. The house, which had felt haunted in its way, inhabited by more than just the living, settled into a different kind of normalcy. The twins were simply Jennifer and Gillian now. No quotation marks, no asterisks, no silent acknowledgement of others peering through their eyes. In 1987, when the twins were adults, a documentary crew interviewed them about their experiences. Jennifer, by then a woman in her late 20s, spoke carefully about what she could recall. She remembered the feeling of knowing things, she said. The certainty that would come over her in certain places or situations. But pressed for specifics, she could offer almost nothing. It was like trying to remember a dream weeks after waking, she explained. You know you had it. You might remember that it was frightening or beautiful. But the actual images, the narrative, the details, they're simply gone. Gillian was slightly more forthcoming but equally frustrated by the gaps. She remembered being afraid, she said. A deep fear that she associated with cars and with that particular street, but she couldn't remember why. As an adult with full knowledge of what had happened to Jacqueline and Joanna, she could intellectually understand the connection researchers had made. But the lived memory, the actual experience of remembering dying, if that's what it had been, was completely inaccessible to her now. She had only the vaguest sense of having once possessed knowledge she no longer held. Both women spoke of a strange melancholy associated with this loss, even though they couldn't truly remember what was lost. Jennifer described it as a haunting in reverse. Usually, ghosts are the remnants of the past that won't leave, but this felt like the past leaving her, floating away, and her being unable to hold on no matter how she tried. Not that she had tried as a child, she clarified. The forgetting had been natural, effortless, even welcome. But looking back as an adult, knowing something profound had happened to her that she could no longer access, there was grief in that. The Pollock case raises uncomfortable questions about memory, identity, and loss. If the twins truly did carry memories of their deceased sisters, then what was lost when those memories faded? Was it simply information, neural patterns that dissolved as new ones formed? Or was it something more, some essential thread connecting one life to another, a bridge across the ultimate divide that slowly crumbled until the gap was once again impassable? Parapsychologists remain divided. Some, like Stevenson, saw the fading as evidence for reincarnation rather than against it. The pattern was too consistent across cultures to be coincidental. If these were merely fantasies or confabulations, why would they fade so predictably? True imagination tends to grow more elaborate with age, not less. The fact that these memories followed the same trajectory as other documented cases suggested something real was occurring, something that followed natural laws we simply don't yet understand. Skeptics naturally saw it differently. The fading, they argued, proved these were never real memories at all, but rather the suggestible fantasies of young children responding to parental grief and expectation. As the children matured and developed critical thinking skills, the fantasies naturally fell away, replaced by more rational understanding. The pattern existed simply because childhood development follows predictable stages. But neither explanation fully captures what the Pollocks experienced. The loss they felt was real regardless of the source of the memories. Florence Pollock, in one of her last interviews before her death, spoke of it with quiet devastation. "They'd been given something," she said. She didn't claim to know what exactly. Maybe a miracle, maybe a mystery, maybe just a very strange coincidence that felt like grace. But for a few short years, the unbearable had become bearable. The loss that should have destroyed them had been complicated by something inexplicable, and then that too was taken away. Not violently this time, but gently, gradually, the way fog lifts, and you don't notice until suddenly you can see clearly again and realize something that had been there is now gone. The twins grew up. They became themselves, fully and only themselves. They had their own memories now, their own scars and joys and fears that belonged to no one else. The birthmarks remained, faint maps on Gillian's body that matched injuries sustained by a sister who died before she was born. But they were just marks now, nothing more. The weight had lifted. The ghosts had dissolved. And in their place was the melancholy that always accompanies the mysterious when it retreats back into the unknown, leaving us with only questions and the fading echo of something we can no longer quite recall. The skeptics have their explanations ready. They always do. Cryptomnesia, they say. False memories implanted by parents desperate to believe their daughters had returned. The power of suggestion, working on impressionable young minds. Coincidence stacked upon coincidence until a pattern emerges from randomness. And perhaps, in isolation, each piece of the Pollock case could be explained away. But that word, isolation, is where the skeptical arguments begin to crack. Consider cryptomnesia first. The theory suggests that Jennifer and Gillian heard stories about Joanna and Jacqueline, absorbed details without conscious awareness, then reproduced those details as if they were memories. It is a compelling explanation, one that has dismantled other reincarnation claims. But John and Florence Pollock were not sitting their daughters down for bedtime stories about their dead sisters. They were not sharing photographs. They were not, by any account, dwelling on the tragedy in front of the twins. John believed in reincarnation, yes, but Florence remained uncertain, even resistant. The household was not saturated with the past in the way cryptomnesia requires. Then there is the matter of the birthmarks. 2 marks on Jennifer's body, corresponding precisely to the scars Jacqueline carried. Skeptics point to the relative commonness of birthmarks, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. But these were not vague resemblances. The mark on her forehead matched the location of Jacqueline's scar from a childhood fall. The mark on her waist aligned with the mole Jacqueline had carried. Both marks faded as Jennifer grew older, disappearing by the time she was school age, as if whatever force had inscribed them no longer needed to make its point. Parental influence explains some cases. Grieving parents, consciously or unconsciously, shaping their children into echoes of the ones they lost. But the Pollock twins demonstrated knowledge they should not have possessed. They identified toys they had never seen, toys that had been stored away before they were born. They recognized places in Hexham during that single visit when they were 3 years old, places their parents had not pointed out, streets their parents had not named. They did not simply agree with their father's prompts. They led him. They corrected him. They knew. The fear of cars, manifesting spontaneously when the twins were old enough to walk, presents another problem for conventional explanation. Children develop phobias, certainly, but both girls, simultaneously, exhibiting the same terror of the same stimulus, both freezing at the sight of approaching vehicles, both needing to be held back from running in panic. Joanna and Jacqueline were struck by a car. The twins had no exposure to that trauma except perhaps through some channel we do not yet understand. Coincidence is the last refuge of the determined skeptic. Enough random events, given enough time, will align into something that looks designed. But the Pollock case does not present 2 or 3 coincidences. It presents 5 distinct categories of evidence, all pointing in the same direction. Birthmarks, matching scars, spontaneous recognition of objects and places, behavioral patterns mirroring the deceased, unprompted statements about a past the twins never lived, physical fears corresponding to the manner of death. Each alone might be dismissed. Together, they form something more difficult to ignore. What makes this case stand apart in the landscape of reincarnation research is its unique combination of factors. Same family. The girls were not born to strangers across the world. They were born to the same parents who had lost the daughters they resembled. This eliminates the complications of cross-cultural investigation, the difficulties of verifying stories passed through translation and time. Verifiable details. The Pollocks could confirm every recognition, every memory fragment. These were not ancient historical claims or references to people long dead. These were immediate, checkable facts. Multiple witnesses. Not just John Pollock, the believer, but Florence, who doubted. Not just the parents but neighbors, family members, Dr. Stevenson's meticulous interviews, and photographic evidence. Images of Joanna and Jacqueline. Images of Jennifer and Gillian. The resemblance captured in undeniable visual record. Dr. Ian Stevenson built his career on cases like this, but even he acknowledged the Pollock twins occupied a special category. Scientific documentation exists. His interviews, his notes, his careful construction of timelines and verification of claims. This was not folklore gathered decades after the fact. This was investigation conducted, while the evidence was still fresh, while the witnesses were still available, while the girls themselves were still experiencing the memories. Yet the mystery remains. If consciousness survives death, if something essential persists beyond the dissolution of the body, why does it return in some instances and not others? Millions die every year. Millions are born. The vast majority show no signs of carrying forward memories from previous lives. What makes certain souls, if we can use that word, return? Is it the violence of the death? Joanna and Jacqueline died suddenly, traumatically. Does that kind of ending create a tear in whatever fabric separates one life from the next? Or is it the grief of those left behind? John Pollock prayed for his daughters to return. He believed they would. Did his belief create a doorway? And why these specific souls? Why did Joanna and Jacqueline come back to the same parents, the same home, the same small town in Northumberland? If reincarnation follows some logic, some pattern, it is one we have not yet deciphered. The randomness troubles us as much as the possibility itself. Perhaps most haunting is the question of what it means that children can carry trauma from lives they never lived. Jennifer bore the fear of cars, the memory of impact, the weight of a death that was not hers. What does that do to a developing mind? What does it mean for our understanding of identity, of self, if the boundaries between one life and another are not as solid as we assume? The implications ripple outward. If memories can transfer, if fears can echo across the gap of death and rebirth, then who we are is not solely the product of this life, this body, this singular experience. Jennifer and Gillian Pollock are still alive. They grew up. The memories faded, as Dr. Stevenson predicted they would. By the time they were in school, the spontaneous recognitions had stopped. The fear of cars diminished. They became, by all appearances, normal girls living normal lives. But they have chosen silence. Neither speaks publicly about what they experienced. Neither has written a book, given interviews, appeared in documentaries. They know what happened to them, or what they believe happened. They lived through it, and they have decided that some experiences do not require explanation, do not benefit from analysis, cannot be adequately translated into language for public consumption. Their silence is its own kind of answer. It suggests that what they carry is too profound, too personal, too strange to be reduced to sound bites and speculation. It leaves us, The observers, the investigators, the curious, with only fragments. Only the records Dr. Stevenson compiled. Only the testimony of their parents, now gone. Only the photographs and the fading memories of neighbors who watch two little girls point at toys and say, "That one is mine." The skeptics have not been silenced. The believers have not been vindicated. The case remains open, unresolved, suspended between competing interpretations. And perhaps that is where it must stay. Not every mystery yields to investigation. Not every question has an answer that satisfies. We are left with the same question we began with, but now it carries the weight of everything we have seen. Did Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock return from death, reborn as Jennifer and Gillian, carrying with them memories and fears and fragments of lives cut short? Or did grief and belief and coincidence conspire to create an illusion so convincing that even the rational mind struggles to dismiss it? The evidence points both ways. The truth, if there is one, remains just out of reach. And in that uncertainty, in that space between knowing and not knowing, the real mystery lies. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.